your medal, 54!
There is nothing existing between the North and the South to prevent peace but slavery. Everybody knows this, everybody feels this, and yet the great mass of people refuse to confess it, and the government refuses to recognize it.
When the United States of America was formed, all 13 of the original states permitted the enslavement of African Americans. African Americans were brought to America through the treacherous Middle Passage, a journey that would sometimes last up to 6 months. Upon arriving to America, African Americans were sold and then enslaved on plantations by wealthy white landowners. Slaves did everything from running errands to working in the fields. These slaves began their work at a very young age and often worked until their death. Eventually, the states began to form different opinions about slavery, with the North pushing to abolish it and the South wanting to keep it in place. Tensions rose and the American Civil War broke out. In January of 1861, Southern states seceded from the United States of America and formed the Confederate States of America. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which eventually freed all slaves in the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation stated that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed forces of the United States. There was a fear in both the North and South that once African Americans were accepted into the United States Armed Forces, that they would form rebellions. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, accused Lincoln of encouraging these rebellions.
African slaves have not only been excited to insurrection by every license and encouragement, but numbers of them have actually been armed for a servile war.
White men oppressed the freedoms of blacks for years and considered their intelligence, abilities, and humanity inferior to their own. Many African Americans were extremely eager and willing to help the cause and to serve upon their country as soldiers in the Civil War. African Americans also helped in the war efforts during the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. African Americans worked as trench diggers, cart drivers, and cooks, but never soldiers. Frederick Douglass shared his opinion on this by saying,
"Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. There's no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States."
The African Americans who were eager to be helpful in the war efforts eventually found an opportunity to do so. With the assistance and exceptional leadership of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and the spirit of the men of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, they were able to fight valiantly throughout the Civil War in the face of adversity, proving that African Americans were not only capable of being trusted with firearms, but also of being successful soldiers. The Massachusetts 54th Regiment paved the way for future black soldiers in the struggle for equality and had a lasting legacy of strong resilience. Robert Gould Shaw was born on October 10, 1837 in Boston to two wealthy abolitionists, Francis George and Sarah Blake. Shaw was a Harvard dropout and a soldier in the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry. Almost immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the governor of Boston, an abolitionist, Governor John A. Andrew, gained permission from the War Department to form the nation's first all-black regiment. In February of 1863, Andrew issued the Civil War's first call for an African American infantry and requested that the leaders of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment
must be necessarily gentlemen of the highest tone and honor, and I shall look for them in the circles of the educated anti-slavery society, which next to the colored race itself have the greatest interest in the success of this experiment.
When Shaw was just 25 years old, his father approached him about taking command of this new regiment. At first, Shaw sheepishly and humbly declined his father's offer. Shaw received a letter from his mother, who scolded him for declining the offer, saying that he would be a disgrace to her entire life's work, and he agreed to lead the regiment. In a letter to his mother, Shaw said,
"It will not be a position of honor with me to see the war through unless I really occupied a position of importance in the army. I shan't be frightened out of it by its unpopularity."
Governor Andrew also appointed Edward N. Hallowell as lieutenant colonel and General Strong to assist Shaw in leading the regiment. Despite knowing that he and his men would face discrimination at every turn, he now accepted his new responsibility.
"After I have undertaken this work, I shall feel like what I have to do is prove a Negro can be made a good soldier."
Recruiting began in February of 1863 with ads in Boston newspapers and posters around the city. By the end of the first week, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment had a total of 72 soldiers. Governor Andrew sent out yet another request for
young men of military experience, of firm anti-slavery principles, ambitious, superior to a vulgar contempt of color, and have faith in the capacity of colored men for a military service.
Recruiters went through great lengths to find recruits, and by May of 1863, the 54th Regiment consisted of about 1,000 men from 15 northern states, 5 southern states, and 4 border states. Frederick Douglass gave speeches to 3 generations of free black men in Massachusetts to encourage them to enlist in the troops. Douglass said that
liberty won by white men would lack half its luster. Who would be free themselves must strike the blow.
there was an abundance of volunteers, and the supplementary men were given guaranteed spots in the Massachusetts 55th Regiment. The men of the 54th were paid $10 a month instead of the standard $13, despite the fact that they were told they would receive the same pay as white soldiers. As a result, the men in the regiment refused to accept the unequal pay, and some men died without accepting any money from the federal government. They also lacked food, clothing, and other necessary supplies that other soldiers received. Shaw began training his troops in March of 1863 at Camp Meigs in Redville, Massachusetts. Although they were eager to fight, the regiment began their work by digging trenches, loading and unloading artillery, and preparing camps for other troops. While in training, the Confederacy threatened to severely punish officers of black regiments and to enslave black soldiers if they were captured. Even though both Shaw and his men were already putting their lives at stake, they persevered even as their threats grew. As a result of these threats, President Abraham Lincoln issued General Order 233 that threatened reprisal on Confederate prisoners of war for any mistreatment of black troops. This order from the president did not stop the unjust and unfair treatment of blacks in the military. On May 28th, the regiment met at Boston Common and paraded through the streets. Led by Colonel Shaw upon his horse, 1,007 black soldiers and 37 white officers were cheered on by thousands of citizens as they boarded the ships to the south. Shaw wrote his father a letter while in the South that expressed his disappointment at the black regiment being left behind during an order for an attack. About 2 months after departure from Boston, the 54th Regiment was given an almost impossible task: to attempt to take Fort Wagner. Shaw asked his men to prove themselves and reminded them that the eyes of thousands will look on to what they do tonight. General Strong also said,
"Boys, I am a Massachusetts man, and I know you will fight for the honor of the state. I am sorry you must go into the fight tired and hungry, but the men in the fort are tired too. There are 300 muskets behind those walls, and they have been fighting all day. Don't fire a musket on the way up, but go in and bayonet them at their gun."
Shaw led his regiment into Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863, and they were immediately outnumbered and outgunned by the Confederate soldiers. The attack was described by Irving Weirstein, an author of Civil War books, as
The blacks fell in heaps, cut down by the rain of bullets. For a few seconds their comrades stood still and confused. They heard the wounded screaming. They saw the dead lying sprawled where they had fallen.
During the attack on Fort Wagner, the 54th suffered great casualties. Nearly half the men were wounded, missing, captured, or deceased. In an attempt at humiliation, Charleston papers of South Carolina reported that General Shaw was buried with his niggers. William Carney, a soldier of the 54th, is considered to be the first African-American soldier to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. In World War I, 350,000 African-Americans had fought on the Western Front in segregated units. It was not until 1948, with Executive Order 9981, issued by Harry Truman, that armies became desegregated. The legacy of the 54th lives on in the heart of Boston, across from the Boston State House. A beautiful bronze statue, paid for by private donations, crafted by Augustus St. Gaudens, was uncovered on May 31st of 1897. The statue features Shaw and his men, each with distinct characteristics, rather than the usual cartoonish depiction of blacks at this time. The statue not only united the state of Boston during the Boston busings in the 1970s, but also continues to unite the city as a whole today.
Where yonder lies the gold of freedom. The way to the treasure is hard, the road long. We shall persevere, we shall endure, we shall overcome someday.